Good afternoon to everyone. It is my big pleasure to welcome our special today's guest, Diego Krivochen from the University of Reading. Diego is collaborating with the Department of General Linguistics since 2014. So it's been already the 5th time he's known us, and hopefully not last. He is mostly famous as the author of the theory of radical minimalism, but his work is much more wider. His approach to linguistics is very interdisciplinary. His work interrelates formal linguistics, mathematics, and physics. And he is trying to find the place of syntax among the nonlinear dynamical systems, which will also be the topic of today's lecture. So thank you very much, and enjoy the lecture.
Right, good afternoon everyone. Thanks for coming. Let's try to make this as painless as possible. So let's start from the beginning, and I mean the very beginning. I'm not so much interested in Aristotle's definition of the parts of speech, but I am interested in the fact that in the definition of the parts of speech, he makes reference to significant sounds. So he already distinguishes explicitly two planes in language, two aspects to natural languages, sound and meaning. So we have that, bear that in mind. Now, what is the nature of sound and meaning when conceived of from an internalist perspective? So what's the place of sound and meaning in our heads, let's say? And Saussure has something really interesting to say here. So basically, our thoughts, apart from this expression in words, is only a shapeless and indistinct mass. Not to say mess. So the idea is language is there to structure sound and meaning. Against a floating realm of thought, would sounds by themselves yield pre-delimited entities? Such a wonderful expression. No more so than ideas. Phonic substance is neither more fixed nor more rigid than thought. So the nature of sound and the nature of meaning before it's being structured by language is, in Saussurean terms, similar. Now, let's see how he structures these shapeless and indistinct masses. The linguistic fact, he says, can therefore be pictured in its totality, that is language, here it's langue, as a series of contiguous subdivisions marked off on both the indefinite plane of jumbled ideas, so the plane of thought, and the equally vague plane of sounds. Just that. That's a rather wonderful picture, isn't it? Because we have these two continua, and what language does in Saussurean terms is precisely put boundaries and say, well, this bit is a pairing of sound and meaning. Let's call it a sign. This bit is a pairing of sound and meaning, and so on and so forth. Now, different syntactic systems will locate these boundaries in different places. That's an interesting thing as well. Now, we are interested now in what is the relation between these two internally to the system. Right? So we know we have sound and meaning. We know that they are related somehow and that linguistic reality makes use of both sound and meaning, particularly for the semioticians amongst you. But what is the internal relation between sound and meaning? And here, Tenier comes to our rescue. So his idea is that there is a tension between the structural order and the linear order. So in his dependency grammar, in which dependencies are established among significant elements, so dependencies are essentially syntactic/semantic entities, there is a tension between the structural order, which has several dimensions, and the linear order, which has one dimension. That's the very well-known principle of the linearity of the linguistic stream of speech. We can only produce one sound at a time. However, structure and semantics is by no means limited to one-dimensional strings. So, in Tenier's view, there is a tension, and the resolution of that tension is squaring the circle of language. That's a wonderful expression, can't tell me otherwise. Its resolution is the sine qua non condition of speech. So we cannot externalize language if not by dynamically solving the tension between structural order, which has several dimensions, because at each point we have many possible structures, and the linear order, which has only one dimension. So let's recapitulate. What we have is two spaces. We have the continua of sound and meaning, also known as the continua of form and content in Yamslevian terms. We also have a tension between these two. So these two, sound and meaning, are not just getting along nicely. They actually have different conditions. One is multidimensional, bless you, and the other one is unidimensional, and they are in tension, and that tension needs to be solved dynamically in order to externalize language. And we also have we as a linguistic community, hopefully, have some sources of agreement, things we more or less can talk about without getting at each other's throat. We have the existence of structural relations in language. So language displays structural relations. It's not just strings. There are strings, but it's not just strings. If you're interested in the psychological side of things, you have a further requirement that those structures be somehow represented in the mind. And moreover, if you're concerned about the neurophysiology of language, you have a further requirement that the mental states be externalized and represented in the brain. But essentially, we're just going to deal with two spaces, the tension, and the existence of structural relations in language. We're going to leave psycho and neuro-linguistic concerns for another time. Now, against this background, what do we need? What we need is, to begin with, a set of formal mechanisms to analyze these two spaces, sound and meaning, and their interaction. We want to make that explicit. And also, we must delimit the phase space for linguistic computation. So what's a phase space? A phase space, we're going to see in just a minute, is the space in which all possible states of a dynamical system are represented. So basically, what this means is we want to know what language as a system can do and what it absolutely cannot. We want to separate what's possible, which is not the same as grammatical. What is possible, which is a possible state of the system, and what is absolutely out. And also, we want to describe and explain the internal dynamics of the phase space. So, think of this as if we were drawing a map. We're drawing a map of a certain territory. So first we mark the frontier, the boundaries between our, say, country and the other countries, and then we describe the internal, the internal topography of the country we're describing. So that's what I think we need to do. And this has been addressed This has been part of the agenda for 20th century linguistics, and actually way back, but let's limit ourselves to the past 100 years or so. But how has this been addressed? On transformational generative grammar, so let's see how things got to the point at which they are now. In transformational generative grammars, sound and meaning are two different systems. They are not generative, they're both interpretive, generative semantics notwithstanding. And the syntactic component is the only generative component, and there are several layers of non-audible structure. So you had deep structure and surface structure, then you have D structure and S structure. Now you have whatever is built only by merge and whatever is built by internal merge or whatever. You always have pre- and post-transformational structures, even though they might not be levels of representation. But of course, transformational generative grammar is just one of the very many beautiful theories in the linguistic landscape. In glossomatics, which is one of my favorite theories of all times, you have two continua, expression and content. So basically, expression is sound, content is meaning. And language is form, not a substance. So basically, it goes back to the Saussurean intuition that what we're doing is establishing boundaries over an otherwise unstructured continuum. Simpler syntax is a very interesting one. In this theory, syntax mediates between sound and meaning. So it's not the case that we have, can you all see if I write here? Yep. So it's not the case that you have syntax and it feeds semantics and phonology. So that's the Y model. In simpler syntax, syntax is in the middle, and you have semantics and morphophonology. So it takes away the I am the only generative component thing that syntax has in transformational generative grammar. And it also establishes that explanation imputes the minimal amount of structure between semantics and phonology. So whatever syntax is in simpler syntax, the idea is it has to be as simple as possible while representing the relations between sound and meaning. We're going back to that. HPSG and LFG, all the properties are specified in lexical items. So again, we have sound, we have meaning, and all properties are specified in the lexicon. And syntax is basically a set of functions which project lexical properties into different kinds of trees. So in LFG, you have constituent structure, you have functional structure. They specify the form of the constituent dependencies and the function that each constituent plays in the sentence, and it's all based on lexical specifications. Construction grammar is another interesting one because it also goes back to the Saussurean intuition. So construction grammar is based on constructions which are conventionalized pairings of form and meaning. So in construction grammar, the relation between semantics and morphophonology is at the very core of the theory. Whereas in transformational generative grammar, notice there is no communication between these two. However, the problem is that the grammatical knowledge of language is constructions all the way down. It's like turtles all the way down. And there is some point in which the problem with construction grammar, we're not getting into that, but it's a very beautiful idea that goes back quite a while. Then performance-based grammars, again, grammars conventionalize sound and meaning pairs based on usage preference. So the idea of having this overview is for you to take into consideration how influential the idea that we have sound and meaning somehow related by means of syntax has been. Now we're getting physical. Now is where the fun part starts. What is a dynamical frustration? Dynamical frustration, and I'm going to say why this is relevant in like 15 seconds, is a tension between opposing tendencies which gives rise to a certain kind of dynamical stability. So basically, you have a certain requirement, call it A, you have a certain requirement B, they are mutually incompatible, but the system just doesn't give up and explode. It actually solves that tension between requirements A and B dynamically. So that's why it gives rise to a dynamical metastability, because you can't reach a state in which we're all happy. A dynamically frustrated system is at all times negotiating how on earth we can attain stability. Now let me give you a physical example, which is how these things originated. Theory of dynamical frustration appeared to account for what's called spin glass, which is neither glass nor spinning, so it's a very disappointing name. If we have a triangular electron lattice, so this is an electron, this is an electron, and this is an electron, electrons can have one of two spin properties, can be spin up or spin down. Let's further assume that this lattice has the condition that no two contiguous electrons can have the same spin. So let's say this guy is spin up, this guy is spin down. What do we do with this one? If it's spin up, then the constraint of anti-alignment will be satisfied here, but not here. If, on the other hand, it's spin down, we will have this and this are different, but these and these are the same. This is a dynamically frustrated scenario. So what happens when we have one of these structures, which appear actually in crystalline structures? Well, what happens is that all these guys are flipping all the time. So spin up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, and so on and so forth. So they are solving this tension dynamically, giving rise to metastability, because we don't have a single arrangement which is stable over time. It actually flips all the time. Now, why have I mentioned this? Well, because what some of us are proposing is that the kind of tension between the several dimensions of structure and meaning and the one dimension of the speech string that we saw with Tenya is precisely a dynamical frustration. And what we have is mutual requirements, one of having just linearity and the other one of having rich structure to represent relations in the world. They're mutually incompatible, but they solve dynamically, and that's precisely what Tenya said. Now, Juan Uriaguirre and Doug Sadie, among others, argue that there is a dynamical frustration at the neurological and computational level. So the dynamical frustration, so the tension between sound and meaning, would be just the computational one. There are arguments to claim that actual neurons are dynamically frustrated in the way they interact with other neurons. This is slightly more problematic because then you have to bridge the gap between the hardware, so the brain, and the software, that is computation, but it's there. The relation is there. Now, a crucial feature of complex dynamical systems, we're going to see what each of these mean in just a little bit. This is a really interesting quotation from Philip Binder, published a paper in Science 2008 on dynamical frustration. It's a page and a half. A system without dynamical frustration will either settle to equilibrium or grow without bounds. So equilibrium here is a stable state that just stays there. Things don't change anymore. So if we had, in the triangular lattice, if we didn't have the requirement that no two electrons could have the same spin specification, well, we could have just all spin up, and that would be equilibrium, and that wouldn't be very interesting, would it? Now, what is a dynamical system, and, may I add, why should we care? A dynamical system is a system or collection of systems in which a function describes the time dependency of a point. So basically, it's a system that evolves in time, and we can track how it evolves in time in a certain space, whose properties may also vary. So dynamical systems behave within a space of possible solutions. So all the possible states of this system are represented in what's called the phase space. Now, some properties, and now we'll see why this is particularly relevant. Dynamical systems are open to external influence. They're complex, that is, they contain subsystems. They're dynamic, meaning change over time. So when we're talking about a complex dynamical system, it's just a system which changes over time, it's dynamic, and contains subsystems. It's complex. It displays emergent behavior, that is, the sum is greater, so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So for those interested in pragmatics, you will have seen something about emergence, because meaning is, the non-natural meaning in the Gricean tradition is precisely emergent. We have nesting and hierarchical organization. So if you've ever seen a fractal, in a fractal you have sometimes perfect self-similarity. You have the whole within the part, within the whole, within the parts, and this is precisely nesting hierarchical organization. Of course, we don't need that to go all the way to infinity, but in a complex dynamical systems, you can zoom in and you will have something going on. And there are attractors. So the system is not just doing random stuff. It actually has a trajectory in that phase space in which it tends towards certain points, which are points of metastability in this case. A dynamical system is non-linear if outputs are not directly and linearly proportional to inputs. We'll go back to that. Now, why should we care? Well, first of all, because it's cool, but second of all, because the kind of system we have been describing, that is, a system in which we have two subsystems, sound and meaning, defined by attention and evolving in time, is precisely a dynamical non-linear system. And, this is very important, we already have a rich array of tools to study these. So it's not that we have to devise a new discipline ex nihilo. We actually have a lot of tools to study these, and they have been applied to the study of cognitive systems. So cognitive systems actively, both in their neurophysiological level and at the computational level, avoid equilibrium. So if you have a bunch of neurons, if you have a neural network, the creatures, the little neurons will start, will communicate, some will die, some will be born. So if you know what the game of life is, it's pretty much that. They avoid equilibrium because it means inactivity. So equilibrium would be all the neurons are dead. That's equilibrium, but we don't want that, and that doesn't happen actually. These systems cannot grow without bounds. So remember that in Binder's quotation, he said that a system without dynamical frustration would either settle to equilibrium or grow without bounds. We have neither. So that's a further conceptual argument to find some interest in the approach of dynamical frustrations. We do find points of metastability which are attractors. Now, at the computational and physiological levels, this is what we are studying with our group at the University of Reading, and there are some people in Maryland as well. Computational and physiological levels, some of these systems display frustrated behavior. We're not saying that every single cognitive system does, because some systems do cooperate. So some systems reinforce each other, like eye-hand coordination. However, we do think that the tension between mutually incompatible tendencies, high dimensional rich structure for meaning, low dimensional string structure for morphophonology, is at the very core of computational dynamics. Well, nonlinearity has been proposed already. Now we extend that proposal to computation. Now let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that you're more or less on board with me and that I've managed to persuade you that it's worth looking at language in its computational side and possibly even in its implementational side from the perspective of complex nonlinear systems. So the question that arises immediately is, how do we characterize them? So can we just keep saying what we've been saying but with a prettier title? Well, no. And I'll give you a very quick example, which is very illustrative, I think. Consider that beautiful equation there, which models, it's been used for decades already, to model population dynamics. So what happens to a population over the year or over some time, discrete time? So you have X is the ratio of current population to the maximum possible population between 0 and 1, and R models fertility. So what we do is basically you can play with the values of R. You can play with the values of R. You choose your R between essentially, let's say between 2 and 3.5 for the time being. And then you see what happens when you start feeding the function. When you start feeding the function, very interesting things occur. That's what you get. So between 2.4, this is values of R, 2.4, 2.6, 2.8, this is rather boring. Now you have a bifurcation. So what does this mean? Well, it means that if you choose, let's say, 3.2 as your value, you feed the function, and after a certain number of iterations of the function, you will start getting only one of two results, which are represented here as X. So it will stabilize, but it will not stabilize at one value. It will stabilize at 2. Then if you go further down, and if you increase your R, you will get 4, and then you will get 8, and then you will get 16, 32. But it doesn't go period doubling all the way. It actually starts going batshit crazy. And that's chaos. So the question is, how do we characterize what's going on there computationally? Because the problem is that what is valid for a segment is not valid for the whole thing. So whatever we use, let's assume, and this has been done already, let's assume that we can model what's going on there by means of a hidden Markov chain or any other finite state kind of device. That's good. Then we go to the bifurcations. And that's more difficult, so we have to shift up computational power. But it's only good until we get to chaos. So the idea, when I give this example, is that whatever is valid for a local domain is clearly not valid for the whole system. However, does it mean that we need to throw whatever is valid for a local domain aside? I don't think so. Because when we're faced with a dynamical nonlinear system, the Chomsky hierarchy has little value. The reason why it has little value is because the Chomsky hierarchy is based on an inclusion relation between grammars and languages, such that unrestricted languages implemented through Turing machines properly contain context-sensitive languages implemented through linear-bound automata, which properly contain context-free languages implemented through push-down automata, which properly contain regular finite-state languages implemented through Markov chains or whatever. So if you say, well, my grammar will be mildly context-sensitive, let's take Yoshi's model. So if you're at a certain level of the Chomsky hierarchy, it covers up everything below. And that for formal language theory, that works pretty well. What we are proposing is that if indeed the computational basis of natural language in human brains is based on or can be characterized by means of using nonlinear dynamical systems, then that subset relation doesn't really work. And that has been noticed in terms of if we are just on one level of the Chomsky hierarchy, sometimes we will have too much structure for very simple strings, and sometimes we will have not enough structure for more complex strings. Now, computation in dynamical system, now we're getting into how this would work, and I hope I have some time for examples. Yes, I think I will. So all the theories we saw in the brief historical summary we did propose some kind of computational system. So they all recognize some kind of structure, which is identified with a level in the Chomsky hierarchy of normal grammar. So normal grammars, what does it mean? Well, it means that every context-free rule is generated by a grammar that contains one of these rules. So A goes to BC, where B and C can appear at the left-hand side of the rule, or A goes to B, where B does not rewrite. So just to give an example in case you're not familiar with formal grammars, in that case we have A goes to BC, and then we keep rewriting if we have the rules, or A goes to B. In this case, let's make a toy grammar. Let's see, A goes to BC, B goes to B, C goes to DE, D goes to D, and E goes to A. So what happens here, this is a context-free grammar. We start from A goes to BC, B goes to B, B doesn't rewrite, so it stays there. C goes to DE, D goes to D, E goes to A, and there we go, and so on and so forth. So that's an example of a normal grammar. Or a grammar in Chomsky normal form, or a grammar in Greibach normal form. So all the theories we've seen assume that something like this is at the core of structure building in natural languages. Some of the theories we've seen, like transformational generative grammar, add something else, like a transformational component. But in some cases, like in lexical functional grammar, basically that's most of what you get, if not all. So you see some examples. So Chomsky famously claimed English is not a finite state language, where a finite state language basically is modeled by means of a transition function between adjacent states, and whatever information we have here We have no memory, so we can't carry it over. So we don't have the possibility of having long-distance dependencies. Not even talking about WH questions. So one of Chomsky's examples was the man who said, is arriving today. The relation between the man, singular, and is, singular, cannot be modeled unless we have some way of carrying the information over several states which are not contiguous. So, from the consideration of discontinuous dependencies, Chomsky, in syntactic structures, concludes that English is not a finite state language. Okay. Yoshi, not the dinosaur, but the computational linguist, proposes that we need mild context sensitivity. Some of you actually got that joke, good lord. Proposes that we need mild context sensitivity, so context sensitivity but a little bit more, to provide structural descriptions for natural languages. And his example were crossing dependencies in Dutch. So you can say something like, John, Mary, Peter saw help swim, which means John saw Mary help Peter swim. Okay? So you have John, Mary, Peter saw help swim. So John saw Mary help Peter swim. We have that crossing dependency. And that goes even further above what we can get with a context-free grammar. So he says the grammar needs to be at least mildly context-sensitive to provide structural description for natural language strings. On the phonological side, Tobias Scheer proposes flat phonology, only linear relation. So everything is flat and finite state. Now, if you remember what we said when we saw the logistic map, what's valid for a local domain may not be valid for the whole thing. So what I'm trying to say is, Chomsky is absolutely right when he says that those examples he analyzes are not finite state, and you can't get a finite state automata, so a Markov chain, to generate structural descriptions for those strings. Yoshi is right when he says that the computational complexity of something like John, Mary, Peter saw help swim is beyond context-free, so we need something else. And I think Scheer is essentially correct when he says, when he proposes flat phonology. What I don't agree with is that English is not a finite state language means there is no adequate finite state description for any string or substring of English. I don't think that's correct. And I'm not the only one. So, to summarize, these, particularly Chomsky and Yoshi's, are good descriptions for local dependencies, but when you extrapolate that to the whole system, you start getting problems. Because if we take a look at it, finite state, context-free, and context-sensitive, so different levels in the Chomsky hierarchy, from the simplest to the most complex, appear all across the linguistic landscape if we look at it locally. In other words, any of these computational systems only partially tessellate the phase space for linguistic computation. So basically, if linguistic computation is a dynamical system and all of its possible states are represented in a certain space, any of these, so finite state, context-free, context-sensitive, describe a portion of that space, and they provide actually adequate descriptions for portions of that space, but not for the whole thing. That's the take-home message. Oh, for crying out loud. Okay, so let's see an example, which Dr. Emmons, I'm sure, knows very well.
My vision isn't good enough to read it.
The man who shows he deserves it will get the prize he desires. Or MiG sentences. Every pilot who shot at it hit the MiG that chased him. Those beauties display locally, so the relation between the and the man, the prize, he deserves it, in that sentence, you actually don't need to go up in the Chomsky hierarchy to model just those parts. So you can have just, we have a state here, transition function, state here, this state is the, this state is man. It's all good. However, when we zoom out a little bit, the man and S bar, so the relative clause, will get the prize S bar. So if we take out the relative clauses, because, well, I'll get to that in a minute, then you have the man will get the prize, which is a simple phrase structure tree. Where is the, this? So let's see, you have the man will get the prize. I swear that's human language, that's not hieroglyphs or whatever, that's actually English. But if we start digging a little bit more, you have a dependency between the man and he, and you have a dependency between it and the object of desires, and also the prize and the object of desires, and it and the prize. You start getting these things crossing on top of one another. However, the computational differences, we argue, arise within local derivational horizons, which just means within tiny, within small substrings. So what you can use to describe the dependencies within a portion of a string might not be useful for the whole thing, but it doesn't mean that you have to throw that away in the first place. So why would we want to have different kinds of computational dependencies? Well, actually, the fact that assuming that the grammar only generates one type of dependency was already noticed by Chomsky and Miller in '63, and more recently by Lasnik and Uriagereka. The idea is, so what Lasnik and Uriagereka say is particularly interesting. So what we need should be, as it were, dynamic flatness. So what they want is to have structure, but in order to externalize it, they want to flatten it, to make it a string. Well, there was a string there. Okay, to make it into just a sequence. And Lasnik, when analyzing instances of iteration, says, in a manner of speaking, what we really want is to move down the Chomsky hierarchy, but that is not the answer either. Why? Well, because we're losing all the computational power that we had when we were up. So they both, Lasnik, Uriagereka, and Chomsky's quotations, and have it here, they recognize the need to go down the Chomsky hierarchy locally, but particularly Lasnik also recognizes the problems of saying we're going down, but sometimes we do need to go up. So what can we do? One possibility is, let's go down locally. Let's try and assign a strongly adequate grammar, so an appropriate structural description for every substring, in which an appropriate structural description is nothing more and nothing less than strictly required to capture dependencies. Now, how would this work? This is what we call mixed computation, because what the grammar would do when assigning structural descriptions to natural language strings is mix different kinds of computation. It's not particularly inspired. So this comes from a work on coordination that Susan Schmerling and I wrote a year ago. So what we're saying is that by saying that a system is computationally mixed, we mean that the structural descriptions assigned to substrings need not all be formally identical. So it's not necessary to say English is a context-free language, by which I mean all the strings which are grammatical sentences of English can be assigned an appropriate structural description by means of a context-free grammar. We don't need to say that. We can start from substrings, let's start from bigrams. So, well, what's the simplest dependency we can assign these to? Well, probably a Markov chain. Okay, let's go a little bit further up with trigrams. Is it still enough? Well, maybe it's not. If you have the man goes, you do need to somehow capture that the man is a constituent. So you go up to context-free. And there you go across the string, seeing if the simplest computational system is enough to assign adequate structural descriptions for substrings. In this sense, derivations are by nature oscillatory. In Sadis' view, they go up and down in computational complexity. In compositionality, so when you put things together, you get compositionality, you have to go up the hierarchy. And in chunking, when you separate things, and in flattening as well, you go down. The interesting thing about Sadis' perspective is that it joins together the oscillatory behavior of neural ensembles with the oscillatory behavior of the computation. So that's a potentially interesting avenue, because the kinds of dynamics that we see at the mesoscopic level in neural assemblies are by nature oscillatory. So let's give some examples. If we were going to see, I'll try to make it in 10 minutes, so that's an hour lecture and we're all happy. So one of the first things we did was to analyze the system of Spanish auxiliary verbs, right? Because if we assumed that the grammar is just, that the grammar is limited to generating a single kind of dependency, say, let's say that the only dependency that the grammar can generate is head XP, which is Chomsky's recent view, well, then we would expect that in things like chains of auxiliary verbs, you only get these kind of modification patterns. So basically, if you have a string like auxiliary 1, then auxiliary 2, let's actually do it properly, and then auxiliary 3, the structure that we would expect this to be assigned is, and VP would be auxiliary 1, then auxiliary 2, then auxiliary 3, and then the VP. However, while this pattern of modification does occur, it's not the only one. So basically in Spanish you get three kinds of patterns of modification. You get this one, which is the most interesting one, in which auxiliary 1 modifies auxiliary 2, auxiliary 2 modifies the lexical verb, auxiliary 3 modifies the lexical verb, but neither auxiliary 1 nor auxiliary 2 modifies auxiliary 3.
What's the sentence, please?
Sorry?
Could you just read the sentence?
Yeah. Ha tenido que ser ayudado. He or she has had to be helped. Okay? The only case in which you get this pattern is if auxiliary 3 is passive ser. So that's why we describe this partly. That's partly why we describe this as context sensitive, because this dependency, like jumping over, is only possible if this is passive ser. We have discovered some examples with other auxiliaries, but they are not very clear-cut, so I'm sticking to the passive one. Then you also have cases in which auxiliary 1 modifies auxiliary 2, but not anything else. Auxiliary 2 modifies auxiliary 3, not anything else. And auxiliary 3 modifies the lexical verb. Like in solía poder empezar a trabajar, used to be able to start working. Now, it is not obvious that this kind of structure can accommodate just that. For one simple reason, and that is that if scope is read of C-command relations, here, auxiliary 1 C-commands auxiliary 2, auxiliary 3, and the VP. Thus, we would expect auxiliary 1 to modify this, and this, and this. Neumayer has an article from 1992 talking about iconic relations and syntax, in which he says that the further away an auxiliary is from the verb, so basically the higher it is, the wider its scope. But that's not always the case. Of course, we do have cases in which auxiliary 1 modifies the lexical verb but not auxiliary 2, 2, the VP but not auxiliary 3, and 3. So do you see the difference between these two? Here, for instance, auxiliary 2 is auxiliating and auxilied, or something like that. So it's modified and modifying. It's modified by auxiliary 1, and it's modifying auxiliary 3. Here, there is no auxiliary which is in turn modified by another auxiliary. All auxiliaries modify just the lexical verb. The example is va a haber sido asesinado. He or she will have been murdered. So what we argued in a couple of papers is that in order to provide adequate structural descriptions for these kinds of dependencies in auxiliary chains, things are much more complicated, but for the time being, let's just look at the configurations. We can't say, well, all of these is actually a single kind of dependency, and then transformations happen, or we have some mapping rule, so we can not add rules or levels of representation to the theory if we allow the theory to proceed, if we allow the grammar to proceed locally and say, well, what's the simplest structural description that I can assign these critters? And I would like to finish with an example using coordination. So the coordination is a particularly interesting one because it's been recognized for a while now that there are at least two kinds of coordination, symmetric and asymmetric coordination. From grammar, but also from pragmatics. So there's a very, very good article by Susan Schmerling in 1975 about Gricean pragmatics and the grammar of coordination. And she defines these two kinds of coordination, symmetric and asymmetric. And we can have a very clear example, I think, which let me just tell you the example, and then we'll see the structural description. So we have, I'll try and write it down, if you can read it. So the example is, John bought the milk. And Bill bought the cookies. And we all had a wonderful afternoon tea. So it's a story with a happy ending. So let's consider that for a minute. John bought the milk and Bill bought the cookies and we all had a wonderful afternoon tea. What if I said, Bill bought the cookies and John bought the milk and we all had a wonderful afternoon tea? That works. However, we all had a wonderful afternoon tea and John bought the milk and Bill bought the cookies. It's not ungrammatical or anything, it just sounds weird. So the relation between these two, John bought the milk and Bill bought the cookies, is symmetrical. So you can basically flip them. And it's not necessary to assign any order to the event here, let's call this E1, and the event here, let's call it E2. So the buying of the milk and the buying of the cookies is not inherently ordered. And if you change the linear order of presentation between E1 and E2, nothing suffers much. However, E3, which is the event of having a wonderful afternoon tea, is ordered with respect to E1 and E2. Now let's see the kind of structural description that we assign this. So we have these two structures. John bought milk, Bill bought cookies. And interestingly, it was proved by Greibach in 1965 that if you have a tree which, or any kind of language, any formal language, in which all dependencies are of the kind I am a terminal, I am a non-terminal. So John is a terminal, but here it keeps growing. This can be translated into a finite state sequence without any loss of information. So essentially, and this has been recovered recently by Uriagereka in 2012, if I remember correctly. So the idea is we can just do a finite state approach to those two. Now we have to put them together. Let's do it like that. Why have I used ternary branching? Well, to indicate that there is no figure ground dynamics. So basically, that we could flip this and have bought the cookies before bought the milk, nothing suffers. However, now we have to take this and somehow relate it to having a wonderful afternoon tea. And the interpretation is that first this happened, John bought the milk and we bought the cookies, and then, and possibly as a consequence of, we had a wonderful afternoon tea, because what's afternoon tea without milk and cookies? So we have this paratactic structure in which we can flip things around. This is symmetric coordination. But the relation between these two terms and having a wonderful afternoon tea is asymmetric, because we can't flip it over. We can't have, we all had a wonderful afternoon tea and John bought the milk and Bill bought the cookies. I mean, we can, it just sounds very weird. So what we proposed, Schmerling and I, is something like this. So you see, this is this exactly. What we're doing is imposing a figure ground dynamics or a hypotactic structure. So this is just parataxis. We have hypotaxis here, indicating that this is an asymmetric relation. We can't just flip things around. There is an order, and the order that is traditionally, it's said that this ordering between these two events and this third event arises from a consideration of the manner of the maxim be orderly. So if you follow Grice's maxim be orderly and you present events E1, E2, E3, The conventional implicature would be E1 happened before E2 and E2 happened before E3, thus E1 happened before E3. But that doesn't always happen. So that happens, Schmerling argues, when we have asymmetric coordination. So when we have this paratactic structure, we don't need to impose that order. Actually, you might, but it's not necessary. We impose the hypertactic dependency, and then we get what's actually a mixed computational phrase marker. Why mixed computational? Well, because we had these two finite state substrings by Greibach's theorem. Then we put them together, we get context-free structure, and then we put it into a wider phrasal context in which we have a combination of local units which display a certain kind of dependency, but globally things are different. So despite the fact that this is not a tremendously cool drawing, what we're saying is this is essentially what we have in the logistic map. What's valid for the description of the parts, like this, is not valid for the description of the whole. So I'd like to finish with this. The traditional picture in formal language theory is that we have these subset relations between regular finite state grammars, or a proper subset of context-free grammars, or a proper subset of context-sensitive grammars. And the point is, Chomsky himself, Lasnik, Uriagereka, and others, Emmenbach as well, have argued that there are inherent limitations in the way that phrase structure grammars work. And when you add transformations, those limitations just become more apparent. For formal languages, that works well. So that needs to be said. However, when we're dealing with semantics, so these grammars turn out to be Procrustean in the sense that it's a one-size-fits-all with the caveat that it doesn't always fit. So what we are exploring, and this is very tentative, is that when we are working with natural languages, we need something like this, in which we don't have strict subset relations. There are still, of course, areas. So interpret this as a kind of Venn diagram. So there are context-free languages, which are, of course, not generable by finite state grammars, and context-sensitive languages, which are not generable by context-free grammars, and so on. But if we stick to the idea of assigning just the simplest structure that we can, then we have V space, which is the set of all substrings for which we don't need to go any further up than finite state grammars. And then the background is occupied by Lindenmayer systems, which are wonderful, but what we don't have time to cover. It's already 4:07. Thank you very much.
So now we have 10 more minutes for the discussion. Does anyone want to ask something or comment on Diego's lecture? So feel welcome.
Well, we have a tradition here that only the old speak. At least they're the only ones that say anything at first. So I'll continue the tradition. Otherwise, nobody will say anything. But as I understand it, you're saying that we should build grammars that have context-free subparts. Mm-hmm. Or they should be as simple as possible. But I certainly would not say that some of the implications of all the many things written in the, formal grammar framework actually do what they should, but I mean, in fact, it seems to me that they take for granted something like that, and then they may be obscuring it, but by the way they present it. But when people say things like, I don't know, subject-verb agreement is basically a sister relation between a subject and a verb, they all want to sort of say that these things are local, and then if you get a combination of two, like something like which boys did Mary, or which boys does Mary say are coming. I think all the formal grammars want to say, well, it isn't really that there's a complex thing where you have two, some kind of double number agreement on some kind of structure, and it covers, a whole bunch of complex interwoven stuff. They're all trying to find a model where you just do things sort of on sister constituents, and, they're pretty simple, and then somehow they can be mixed together by, say, WH fronting, and then they give you some complex results. But in fact, it seems to me almost everybody would be trying to say, yes, we don't need those complexities, in their raw form to be modeled. They don't need to be modeled by a formal grammar. The formal grammars themselves will somehow do rather simple things, and then somehow they also, maybe that's the early idea of transformations, meant to these days internal merge or whatever. Then they also cause things to look like the dependencies are more complicated, but actually they're not. Now, it seems to me isn't almost everybody doing these kind of things trying to do that, even though I do fault them for, somehow almost celebrating the seeming complexity of what they're saying. But shouldn't they, couldn't they all be acquitted of the charge of not, say, realizing what you're saying?
Yes and no. So in the so let's take, for instance, something like Jean-Quest hierarchy, or the model of adjectival modification that Lasnik criticizes, which is a phrase structure grammar. So he considers something like the old man. And he, I think, to my mind, rightfully assumes that what merge can do, and the only thing that merge can do, or any translation of merge into a context-free formalism, is old man.
Who's the he? Who are you talking about?
Lasnik.
Oh, Lasnik. Got it.
And what he proposes is that what we need is something like old man. So that's why he says we seem to need to go down. The kind of structure he proposes I don't really buy, because it overgenerates. But the problem that I see is that if you assume that all linguistic structure is formed by recursive combinatorics using merge, you don't really have any escape from this format. And the argument that he makes, Lasnik and Uriagereka and even Chomsky and Miller in '63, is that this is inherently too powerful. So we are including non-terminals here, which actually play no role whatsoever. So yes, partly I agree with your comment. I do think that there are some portions of the grammar in which these problems, as a structure generation is currently formulated, you can't escape this. And we should be able to escape this, because I don't think there's any scope relation between old and old and old. And iteration in general is a more general case, and Uriagereka makes the same argument. So yeah, there's an obscurity in presentation, and I don't think many people would object to saying, yeah, let's keep dependencies as simple as possible, but there are some inherent limitations of the kind of structure building that is assumed in transformational and generative grammar today, which might not be the case in LFG, for instance. In LFG, if you have a lexocentric structure for iteration, you can just have many branches, or in simpler syntax. But they have other problems because LFG, the C structure in LFG is just context-free. So how could you get the agreement in a case like you said, in which you had the boys and then singular and then Mary and then are, right? You have like these crossing things, and they have to complicate things by means of lexical annotations. So it seems to me like the theories that I attempted to summarize actually get part of the landscape right, but we do need to integrate their local wisdom, and I think that the way to integrate that wisdom is by means of saying, well, we have a complex dynamical system, and the subsystems which we can model are precisely these kind of local, minimally adequate dependencies.
Any other questions or comments? So I would like to thank you, and hopefully see you once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.